We're thankful that you decided to join us today. After reading the book that we're going to look into today, I can say that you're in for an enlightening hour. This is the fourth book forum hosted by the Center for Public Finance, which has brought in some of the top minds in public finance and economics. And our speaker today certainly fits that bill. In fact, we've had to rearrange this event 3 times due to various events, including an ice storm in Houston, Hurricane Harvey, and then a pandemic. But finally, we're here. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Casey Mulligan. The Wall Street Journal calls him the economist who exposed Obamacare. He's a professor of economics at the University of Chicago and received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1993. He's been a professor at Harvard University, Clemson University, and the Irving B. Harris Graduate School for Public Policy. Most recently, he served as the chief economist of the White House Council for Economic Advisors during 2018 and 2019. A noted economist and blogger, John Cochran, calls that one of the most, or the highest analytical job in the country for an economist. And I think that's probably true. And he says that Casey, Dr. Mulligan, shined at this job. Casey has received awards and fellowships from the Manhattan Institute, Wolfram Research, the National Tax Association, the Fraser Institute for Public Policy, and various foundations that fund economic research. His research covers capital and labor taxation, the gender wage gap, health economics, regulation, Social Security, voting, and the economics of aging. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished speaker today, and I'm excited to hear more about his book and get some inside details. And so without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Mulligan.
Thank you. You know, I really aspire to come to Houston every year. But as John said, that's getting interrupted. I hope we can end this streak and I can see you guys in person soon. But in the meantime, I do want to share with you a little bit about my book. It's both about the president and about policy. Toward the front of the book is more president intensive, and then toward the back it's more policy intensive, although all the chapters have some of each. You know, I've seen that people really do have fun reading it. The reason I wrote it is when I got to the White House, I immediately realized, you know, what's really happening is not what's being talked about. The public's not being told what's really going on. And I think they deserve to know that, and they would find it interesting. And people do have fun reading the book. I can see that they start to connect the dots once we fill in some real facts of what was going on. So I have a few slides to share. I will start out kind of like I did with the book, a little bit more Trump and less policy, and then we'll glide in the other direction as we go through here. What's it like to meet him? You know, I'd met presidents of top universities. I'd met presidents of major companies before, and many of you have as well. And you know, when you meet such a person, you see that they're talented people. It's rarely is it a surprise that they got where they got. They have some really special talents, and that presumably helped them rise to the top. And the president is like that too. He has some very special talents, and you see that as you interact with him. He also had the range of his talents is really caught me off guard and amazed me. I mean, one of the things that he's very good at, unlike us analytical folks, where we tend to have analytical deductive skills, which he has some of those skills, but he also can really manage a social network. Let me put it that way. He can say, literally 2 or 3 words, and dozens, hundreds, if not thousands or millions of people kind of know where they fit, and they fall into line. So it's pretty impressive to see that. And a lot of the times I was just sitting there with my mouth open, taking it all in and trying to learn from that. An analogy that I use came to my mind. Barry Sanders. I live in Chicago. I've been a lifelong Bears fan. The first time I got to go to a game when I was an adult, so I went a lot of years with never going to a Bears game in person. I went in person. They were playing the Lions, and there was Barry Sanders, unfortunately, for the Bears, because Barry Sanders, he ran around the Bears. He made the Bears look like children. Clearly, Barry Sanders was the biggest talent in the stadium that day among so-called professionals. He was ahead of them all. I can't say that Barry Sanders is the best football player ever. He probably wasn't. Walter Payton has to be better, right? But you felt sorry for his competition, and that's the same impression I got being with the president. I felt sorry for his competition because he really is a rare talent. Will he prove to be the best president ever? People will argue that, and maybe it won't be the case, but he certainly is a rare talent. One of the things that he does, and these are my words, he's an experimenter. He tries different things. I think in business these days, the phrase they use is fast failure. He'll try things. He's not ideological, so he'll try it, and if it doesn't work, stop it and move on and try something else. And I think certainly his voters think that that's something that's needed right now. There's some very tough problems to be cracked, and some of the old ideas weren't working, and maybe you want to try something new. But of course, when you're trying things, some things won't work out, and he's very good at pivoting. And that's a word that he uses, pivoting. Listening, he calls it. I call it gathering data from the experiment, but he's very much when he's trying something, he's going to listen a lot. So my advice to people, anything that you can send him, your feedback, whether it be sending comments into the agency that's making some rule or whatever it may be, he's very much listening, because he's not an ideologue and not married to what approach he's doing. He wants to get the best result, and if that means turning 180 degrees, that's what he does. And part of the fake news that I saw regularly when I was there and before and after is that he doesn't read, he doesn't pay attention. Fake news. And in fact, I had a rare opportunity to do my own, turned out to be an experiment. It wasn't intentional. For this meeting that I'm showing here on the slide, we had a stack of material to show him, for him to look at. And at the last minute, I thought, there's maybe a better way to do one of these pages. That's not part of normal protocol. Normally, you put your stack of materials and it's sent all around the government for everyone to see what the president will be presented before it actually happens. But this one, literally 20 minutes, came off the printer 20 minutes before we were sitting right where we're sitting by his desk. So I know that nobody in the government had seen this page before, and I kind of assumed he would understand it, but fake news would say he can't understand anything that's not coached to him. So we gave him the materials, and I thought this would be his favorite item in the whole stack of stuff we had for him. And we gave him the materials, and we were talking to him about it, and he was listening and also reading ahead. And very quickly he got to this new page that I made and held it up and said, "This is my favorite." Now I don't have, that's government property. I don't have that with me anymore to show you, but I was able to kind of reproduce something, as I remember, pretty similar. It has a very Texas flavor, so that's why I wanted to show it to you. This is a picture of monthly oil production by country, and it shows a couple major oil producers, Russia and Saudi Arabia. and the United States shooting way past. In fact, they had passed up both countries within a few, let's say 6 months of having that meeting. And he thought that was a very good thing to have occurred. And also he had lots of ideas on who needed to see this picture. And in fact, every other thing in the stack we gave him, he had an opinion. I'll come to that later. Here's another meeting we had with him. And this was a learning experience for us. This was in February of this year, and we were talking about the pandemic. It was just, we were just learning about that. And one thing's, Thomas was our leader. He's in the middle of this picture, and he's a health expert, actually the first expert on the economics of contagious diseases, which the coronavirus is such a thing. And he told the president, you know, the flu is contagious, and, you know, a lot of people die from the flu. It's not unusual for 60,000 people in the United States to die in one flu season. And the president immediately said with much authority, Tom, you're wrong. And he often said that in meetings. And if you didn't know the man, you would say, okay, he thinks we're wrong. That's the end of that. We didn't convince him too bad. And what we learned at this meeting, and then we saw this play out many times afterward, when he says that you're wrong like that to us, what it really means is he's going to go back and think about it. This is pretty important. It's changing the information that he had, the way he looked at things, and he need to go back, read, maybe call some people. It turned out the reason he said that we were wrong is because, you know, we're the economic advisors, as John told you. We're not the CDC, and he just assumed a fact like that CDC would have told him. So then when the economists walk in there and start saying important facts that the CDC hadn't told him, he just assumed the economists don't know what they're talking about. That was his first reaction. But he immediately went back and checked and did some reading. And then we saw him a day or two later tell the public, hey, you know, I learned something I didn't know before. It's not unusual for 60,000 people to die from the flu. So he very much absorbed what the staff was giving him, at least in the economic area. I'm not an Army expert or Navy or anything like that. In the economic area, he was an avid consumer of what we had to show him, and a great marketer. He would give the sort of results that I might find got thousands, if not millions of times more attention when it went through him than if it's just something I did on my own. Okay, we'll go a little more toward the policy. President, you know, has a business background. He never really ran for election before, hadn't worked in the government before. And one of the things that people do in business, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the group today who are in business and they know this, they have a budget. If you're running a business, you have a budget for your various managers and vice presidents. You don't just tell them, hey, go out and maximize profit no matter what it costs. You say you have a budget to work within and get as much profit as you can within that budget. And if you find a new opportunity and you need more budget, you can come to me with your hat in hand and ask for a bigger budget. It's a very natural way. Businesses have been run that way. Seems like forever, certainly all of our lifetimes. But believe it or not, the federal government, when it comes to regulation, has never been run that way. Over 200 years, our federal government's been regulating things, and the agencies were just allowed to do what they wanted with no budget. They were just told, go out there, maximize net benefits, make sure that, you know, your rules and regulations have more benefits than costs one by one, but you have no budget on that. It doesn't matter how many costs you create as long as you're getting more benefits. And the president didn't think that's a very good way to run things. They should have a budget, and we have now a regulatory budget. The United States is not the first country to do that. A couple countries, very few countries have done that in the last 10 or 15 years. But now we have one. Within days of walking in to the White House, he implemented a regulatory budget. You might have heard about part of that budget, which is the 2-for-1 rule. For every time an agency creates a regulation, it has to get rid of 2 old ones. Which, again, the man is great at marketing. That's a good way to get people to remember. But the serious part of the budget, which is also there, and of course he understands it, it's harder to communicate, is actually the dollar amount of the cost. So it works very much like a budget in a large business. Each agency has a certain amount of dollars of regulatory costs that they can create, and they can't go above that. And if they have a new regulation they want to put, they better get rid of some old one that has costs. And he's eliminated hundreds of regulations. I worked hard trying to keep up with that. I'm not sure I could do it, but I'm going to give you a few examples, and there's several more examples in the book. And the other thing, this example is going to come from prescription drug regulation. The other thing this example will help us see with regard to the president is how he trades with the fake news. And he finds ways that fake news feels that they benefit and he can benefit. So one of the things that had happened for years upon years is that the Food and Drug Administration was very reticent to approve new manufacturers of generic drugs. And a generic drug, like a lot of generic products, it's a product that's been around for years. The original name brand drug, the guy who invented the drug, he's already off patent. You know, the drug has been around for years. Lots of people have taken it. They've experienced its side effects, and the doctors are familiar with it. These are old drugs, and they go off patent, and now it's time that anybody can manufacture them. And ideally for the consumer, lots of companies would manufacture a generic drug. But the FDA had such a process that barely any manufacturers were able to get the approval. And so the generic drugs were very expensive, costing almost as much as the brand names. And if that's not a rigged system, I don't know what is. And what were the companies benefiting from this? A lot of Chinese companies, Israeli company. And when President Trump came in with his regulatory budget, one of the ways that he thought that the Food and Drug Administration could reduce its regulatory costs would be to start to make it easier for companies to get into the generic drug manufacturing business. And he did that. Here I have a chart of the number of generic drug applications that were approved. They went way up in a course of about a year after doing this. 136 more generic drugs were approved than normal, beyond the normal trend for these things. And we knew in my group, we think about this from an economic perspective. The Food and Drug Administration was creating barriers for businesses to enter those markets. When you reduce those barriers, what happens? First thing that happens, you get more entry. You get more businesses in the marketplace trying to sell to the consumers. What happens next? According to economics, prices get cheaper. So generic drugs ought to be getting cheaper, we expected. Even before we had the data, we could see the drug approval data because we worked with the FDA. We could see that they were indeed approving more companies to do this. And we expected, based on theory at first, that there would be lower prices coming. For generic drugs, for sure, maybe even from brand name drugs, because to an extent, brand name drugs have to compete against the generic drugs. So we did that. I can remember vividly, before I jump ahead, vividly, the first year this was really happening was in 2018. So I was really can't wait to see the 2018 data on generic drug prices. And I knew when they were coming out, they would be released on January 11th, 2019. And in the White House, we get the data a day early. So I would get to see it on January 10th, around 4:30 p.m. And we had already written lots of reports about how this ought to happen. Economics says it was happen. FDA's been doing a good job. We predict it's going to happen. And I couldn't wait to get my hands on that. I remember it seemed like slow motion when they came in with the printout that came over from the Labor Department that calculates the consumer price index. And sure enough, and that's my next slide for you guys, prescription drug prices had been coming down, and for the year 2018 was the first year they were ever lower from the year before, the first time that prescription drug inflation was negative in 46 years. First time in 46 years. So it's been a very, very long time. Drug prices have been going up. As the president said, they've been going up like a rocket ship before I got here. This is the way he likes to put it. And he changed the regulations, relaxed the regulations, allow more entry, more competition. And sure enough, consumers got lower prices. One of the things we calculated is for the year 2018, consumers were saving, and this is for prescription drugs overall, so name brand drugs are included in here. Consumers were saving about 5% just in that first year, or about $19 billion. So that everything worked out according to plan. So what happens? Well, what had happened on that January 10th in the afternoon, actually the government was closed because there were shut down. There was a dispute with Congress, so only a few of us were around. We wrote some tweets for the president. One of the myths, and we'll get into this later, one of the myths is that the president sits around in his bathrobe and does all the Twitter. That's not at all true. Many of these tweets go through dozens of people, if not hundreds. So this was the day when I started composing a tweet, and it didn't go straight to the Twitter, of course. It had to be approved by many people. We composed a tweet based on what the CPI says. CPI, by the way, is the standard for measuring drug prices, measuring inflation in general and for specific products. Thousands of contracts are based on the CPI. It really is the gold standard for data. Not that it's infallible, but it's the gold standard for data. So we wrote the tweet that says more or less what's in this picture, giving the exact numbers. And what does the fake news say? That's a lie. New York Times said it. Chicago Tribune said it. The little newspaper in the town where I grew up said it. All the newspapers around the country, after the president tweeted that drug prices went down for the first time in 46 years, all of them said that it wasn't true. And moreover, it was not based on any data. That's what they said. And then that's what everybody, the public, got to hear. Now, and then this gives you a flavor of how the president works. This is the cold, hard truth, people. The drug prices went down first time in 46 years. That's a lie. Well, then the president's free to change that lie as much as he wants because it starts as a lie, so might as well change it, right? And so he started saying the first time in 50 years, first time in ever, and other types of exaggerations until finally the Washington Post write a kind of lengthy story about what's going on with drug prices. Is it really, really falling? And we see the president working that way. Here's another example where, and here we can get into how he works on the Twitter. I know a lot of you probably think that, especially if you thinking about voting for our president again, you're probably saying to yourself, I wish that man would stay off Twitter. I'm not sure you should wish that, and that's what I want to talk about next. So give another example. Here we are talking to the president about the economic performance in 2018 and how it's going to go into his economic report to the president. And again, how he absorbed this was from a very much a communications perspective. Every single thing we gave him, he said he would tell us who needs to know this. Oh, that needs to be sent to the New York Times. Hey, guys, you need to send this over to Senator so-and-so. Hey, you need to send that to Michael Goodwin over at the New York Post. And he had that kind of advice. And in fact, we got to a point, he said, you know what? Lou Dobbs needs to know this. Hey, call Lou Dobbs. So we called Lou Dobbs, and that's what you're seeing here is a screenshot from the Lou Dobbs show we call into Lou Dobbs, and then we take Lou Dobbs through whatever information the president thought Lou Dobbs needed to hear from us. And that's what we did. So one of the pieces of information we gave him was about the growth rate and the aggregate economy, the GDP growth rate in 2018 compared to previous years. And we had, done all the calculations, and for sure no mistakes. We double, triple, quadruple check before we talked to the president. And we gave him the facts. I think it was the first time in 14 years, or the highest growth in 14 years, something like that. And the president saw that and he said, yeah, this is not going to get enough attention. What do you think, guys? Should I say the first time in 20 years, or the first time in 50, or the biggest growth ever? What's the sweet spot, he asks. And he's kind of asking rhetorically, because he knows us sheepish economists don't know the first thing about social media. He's kind of asking us, what's going to be the sweet spot where we can do that trade, where the fake news will get to call me a liar, but then they're going to have to talk about what I want them to talk about, which is how great the economy is growing. Or in the previous instance I gave you, how much drug prices have stopped growing. So we kind of had that conversation. Then he yells, over here to the side, there's a tiny little, the closest office is a tiny little closet occupied by, let's see, I'll jump ahead a couple. Occupied by this man, Dan Scavino. Dan Scavino is the one who runs the Twitter. And he said, Dan, come in here. And Dan runs in with his laptop. He's the only person allowed with a personal electronic device. By the way, I never saw an iPhone or any personal electronic device of the president's in the Oval Office. So again, the image that he's sitting there with his phone and his bathrobe, not the opposite of what I saw. The man with the electronic device is Dan Scavino. And he says, Dan, just take their chart off of here and type exactly into the Twitter what these economists have written in the report. And so Dan copied it exactly and sent it out on Twitter. And he said, if this doesn't get enough attention the first time, then we can think about exaggerating it. And that was a common pattern. He would always start out with the exact thing that we gave him, all the numbers done exactly correct, no exaggeration. And then he'd see how it takes. And then if that didn't work, he would try to arrange a trade with the journalists. They get to call him a liar, but then they got to go through and explain what is it he's lying about, and that's what he wants. To give you other examples, he says things like, I'm the best president for African Americans since maybe Lincoln. Of course, it's not true, but then he forces the Washington Post and the New York Times to do an analysis. Well, is Trump, what has he done for African Americans? And then they have to kind of list some things, and then they got to make the argument, see, he's not as good as Lyndon Johnson. But victory from the president's point of view, they still had to list, the things that he's done. Okay, so you kind of got the idea of the relationship between the normal media and our president. He did not get supported by people in Washington. He was supported by the people in the flyover country. The media doesn't like him. Most of Washington doesn't like him. Even the Republicans in Washington didn't want him to be the president. And so he's got to communicate somehow. And having CBS or NBC or CNN be the middleman is not going to work. So he needed some other channel. And this is what you might call the new fireside chat, which is the Twitter. And real Donald Trump is his Twitter handle, as they call it, his Twitter account. And he's got, by now, past 70 million followers. So he's got a lot of people following him on Twitter. Furthermore, he has, surveys have shown that 3/4 of US adults see, hear, or read about his tweets a lot or a fair amount. Okay, so now you're getting into 180, 190 million people, not just his followers, because those of you who are on Twitter, that the tweets can be retweeted, to people who aren't, so people who aren't his followers would see it. They can be repeated on news programs and newspapers, and they are. So he's reaching with the Twitter directly with really no middleman, more than double the number of people watching a typical presidential debate, way more people than normally will watch the Super Bowl. And he's doing this every day. I say he, Dan Scavino, is doing it every day, multiple times a day. So this is an indispensable way of communicating. So I'm not sure I want him to get across Twitter. Now, how did he get these 70 million followers? How does he keep their attention? Of course, he's got to have bizarre, bombastic stuff in there to keep people tuned in. That's part of the trade. Again, he understands things in life are trade-offs, and that's the trade-offs, how he evaluates them. Okay, here's that tweet that I told you about. This is exactly as we wrote it. Dan Scavino copied into his laptop. You notice what it says on the bottom there? It came from Twitter for iPhone. No way. I don't know how. Every one of his tweets says they come from Twitter for iPhone. I never seen any iPhone. Dan Scavino had a laptop. Maybe Dan's got some kind of software. Maybe he transfers it to a phone later. But people sitting around on phones tapping into tweets is not something I ever saw happen, and I'm doubtful that it happens. And then later he would exaggerate this point once he decided that this exact truth was not getting enough attention. Another thing to understand about the president with the Twitter is, remember I said he's an experimenter and he tries things. And so when you see him tweet something, you want to understand it in that light. Here I have a tweet of his about automobile regulation, which we had been doing for 2 years. He was well aware of. It's really his signature deregulatory action. He never tweeted about it for 2 years. When did he tweet about it? When he wasn't sure what to do. He got a lot of pressure from the car companies. Car companies did not want him to totally eliminate President Obama's automobile regulations. They wanted him to soften them, but not eliminate them. And he was getting a lot of pressure for them, and he was going to test the waters and see, how much do people want me to fight the auto companies on this? And so when I saw this tweet in August 2019, I said, uh-oh, he's not going to remove Obama's regulations. He's going to soften them. And sure enough, in October, a couple months later, the news was out that the auto regulations were not eliminated, just softened, more or less exactly the way the car companies wanted them. Here's another one for maybe you Texans to worry about. I live in Illinois, so maybe I'm okay with it. This was in April. He tweets out, very good explanation of why blue states should not be bailed out with congressional money. He says it quite eloquently in ways that all the Republicans can look at this and say, yes, President Trump understands how we feel about this issue. It's too bad, guys. The fact that he's even doing this means he's entertaining the idea of giving Nancy Pelosi that particular favor if she can give something in return. And this proposal is still alive today. It wouldn't surprise me if we hear in the next week or two that the blue states are going to get some bailout money. Okay, how much time do we have? I have maybe 5 more minutes. I lost track of the time a little bit.
Yeah, let's do 5 more minutes, and then we can take questions. If the audience wants to type questions in the bottom lower box where it says "Ask a question."
Good. Okay. So then, but the 5 minutes less, I'm going to jump ahead to one of the failures. There are failures. And I want to have, again, one that has a little bit of a Texas flavor to it. So this picture I'm showing you here is a foggy day on the ocean. And on the day I want you to envision, you weren't there, but maybe you can envision it with me. Man wakes up. He lives on the ocean. There's this fog out there early in the morning. And he thinks he hears somebody out in the water saying, help me. It's not something he normally hears. So he yells back, do I hear a cry for help out there? And the guy says, and then he hears, I'm drowning, I'm drowning. So he gets with his son. They got a little boat on the shore. There's no marina or anything nearby, but they had a little boat in their grass, and they threw it in the water and rowed out there. Man told his son, beware, drowning people, they can try to drown you too. So we'll beat him with an oar if he tries to do that to us, but let's go out there and see if we can save him. And so they go out, they row out about 100 yards, and they find the man. He's not going to drag him in the water. The man's got no strength. Turns out the man had been out there all night, and he was just about to drown because he had lost all his strength. And what had happened, here's a New York Times article from shortly after when that happened. That man had a boat called the Karen E, recreational boat, and he was out there and with his wife and his daughter, and with a neighbor and the neighbor's wife and the neighbor's daughter, and the boat sank. Why did it sink? I'll show you the next picture. This is a picture, if you can see, there's a tugboat here on the right towing a barge, and there's a big tow rope here. And what happened, I'm going to put a little X on the picture. The Karen E got stuck in front of the barge and stuck in the tow rope, and the tug captain was apparently not aware and ran him over, and the boat sank, and everybody died except for the one gentleman that was yelling help the next morning. This type of arrangement that you see here, tugboat towing the barge, you see that in the United States a lot. I took this picture myself recently in the Delaware Bay. You see it often in the United States. Other countries don't do this. This is dangerous. But the reason that we do it is because shipping is so ridiculously expensive along our coastal waters. Shipping from one part of the United States to another is ridiculously expensive. And by using this barge operation where you don't really need people on that barge, and the barge is something that can be made relatively competitively in the United States, this is the way we do it because of the totally ridiculous regulations. There's a prohibition. You're not allowed to use foreign crews or foreign ships or foreign licensed ships in any way in shipping along the coastal United States. So you get this dangerous operation so that regulation can serve the special interests. And a result of that, you may have remembered this picture in 2018 when Trump got a lot of bad press for saying the wrong thing to Vladimir Putin. But the real news that would happen that day, this was July 16, 2018, the real news is that this story came out about how people in Massachusetts are getting their energy from Russia. And the reason is they can't get it from Texas because that would require a Jones Act compatible. And that's the regulation, the ridiculous regulation. It's 100 years old now that requires that you prohibits using any foreign elements of the transport from Texas up to Massachusetts. So they have to get their energy from Russia instead. And the president tried to get rid of this. I got this from the Texas Controller's website, an example of how much cheaper it is to ship across the ocean than it is along the U.S. coast. And so that's why a lot of the East Coast people get their energy from Russia and Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and not from Texas. President tried to get rid of this, and the swamp creatures really came at him hard, and he backed off. He didn't want to spend his political capital on that, for the time being at least. He's actually the first president who have not promised the special interest that he will not touch the Jones Act. He has not promised that. Every other president has. Reagan, name it, you name it, Johnson. He hasn't promised that he won't touch it, but so far he's tried to touch it, but it burned him, so he pulled his hand back. So that gives you a little flavor of the types of things that the president deals with, the type of policies that he has, and really the political challenges that he's involved with. He's really a political entrepreneur. Let me end with this. He's a political entrepreneur. He's first person in a long, long time to kind of build on a populist voting bloc, and to go against the people kind of running the show. And that's an innovation. And maybe he'll turn out to be like the BlackBerry, where it was a great invention, but there's an even better invention that'll improve on it further. Somebody may improve on his populist approach and take it better, and that may be the case. But populism is here to stay because there's been a lot of policy mistakes, and we kind of need fresh blood in there to try to fix some of these things. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mulligan. That was fascinating. I have a couple of questions. We don't have any from the audience yet, but if they want to type them in the bottom right portion of their screen in the chat box, we can get to those. In the book, you noted that the CEA published 17 supply and demand reports in the economic report of the president. And here, yes, here's the question right here from Dr. Evans. What are some examples of the theories that came out of that?
We didn't invent supply and demand by any means. Alfred Marshall gets a lot of credit. I think a lot has to do with the president and his policies. Supply and demand analyses don't support a lot of policies that other presidents have had. And therefore, in some sense, it wasn't that welcome in the White House. But as we discussed with prescription drugs and so many other things, we did the first supply and demand analyses of homelessness. That was in the last economic report of the president. The analysis is, that type of analysis turns out to be very supportive of what the president does. So it was very welcome. And related to that, we had a lot of Chicago people there. And in Chicago, we still embrace, nurture, and develop supply and demand type of methods. And these are intertwined. I mean, he wouldn't have had so many Chicago people there if supply and demand analysis were anathema to what he was trying to do. So we use supply and demand on everything: opioids, homelessness, even tariffs. We use it on tariffs. We use it on everything.
Oh, I found the opioid chapter maybe one of the most interesting chapters, because you could see that you really did employ a lot of supply and demand analysis, and yet there were these competing camps or groups. And so how did the president react to that?
So let me give people a little background who haven't read the book yet. The opioid epidemic is 2 decades old at least. People overdosing on that particular type of drug, and it, very, very common. A lot of people here probably know a person or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 who died that way well before natural age. And what are the reasons for that? Of course, we can always say they're complicated, and I guess they are. But one thing that was happening is the federal government was fueling it. The federal government was subsidizing prescription opioids, for example, up and down the supply chain. And not realizing that that was going to have an unintended consequence. It means more people will buy them, more people will take them, more people will overdose and fatally overdose on them. That was unintended. I don't know anybody who wanted that to be the result. But then the people in the government, when they make a mistake, like a lot of us, when we make mistakes, we don't want to admit it. But it's the government now, so there's not competition. There's not like another government who can come in and say, we can serve the customer better. In fact, you would be roundly criticized if you tried to put somebody in charge of one of these agencies, such as the agency that subsidizes opioids, who didn't have a long resume of experience in that agency. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to work. And even if you were able to avoid the media storm of that, the agency itself might not be very supportive. And I think one Congressman Price, who was an outsider to that, and he was the head of it for a little bit, he had a lot of trouble. The veteran people in that agency were not supportive of him. Not necessarily because of the opioid issue, but it just, to bring an outsider in there is so difficult. And I saw that firsthand and rather vividly and explained in the book with regard to opioid policy. But it happens throughout the government. And
Yeah.
I think the president experiencing actually the worst in the defense area. He would call it the endless wars, and I would agree with him. You know, a lot of people who made their careers in the Department of Defense are rather invested in those activities. And I don't mean invested in the narrow sense of Charles Schwab. I mean that their expertise and so on is built on that. And when he talks about let's get the kids out of Vietnam, out of Afghanistan and get them out of Iraq, he gets a lot of pushback from the people in that area who think that that's been a good idea and needs to be continued to some degree. And if he puts someone in charge of the Department of Defense or Department of State who did not have a lifetime of experience on that, not going to go well. And this is a major problem. And I think I said he might be the BlackBerry and the iPhone's coming. The next guy needs to figure out how to do that better. He did that in a few areas, but he has people with good resumes, I'll put it that way, running a lot of these agencies, and it makes it tough to acknowledge the failed policies, let alone fix them.
Yeah. So we have a question from the audience. What will Trump do to start lowering the national debt? So I think I'll add in, when is the right time to start lowering the national debt? So obviously it wouldn't have been in February, at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think we're probably not there yet, but how long until, in your estimation, how long, was this ever discussed? If not, what is your opinion?
Yeah, my service finished before the virus, thankfully, because working there was even harder, I think, during the virus. So I did not discuss, other than I was there, the last time I was there is in that picture I showed you at the very beginning in February. And there at the $1 trillion spending packages were not being discussed at that time. I will say that the president, it was low on his priority list, lowering the national debt. I remember him saying a few times, we're going to do something that's going to cost money, and where's it going to come from? He's like, well, the wheels of revenue and debt will just have to turn a little faster. He wasn't real worried about it. I think
most politicians don't seem to be real worried about it.
Right. I like to put my Kotlikoff hat at this point, where Professor Kotlikoff's view of these things is, just don't focus on the debt. I mean, you want to focus on generational equity. So
sure, what
are we handing down to the next generations? And if it's a lot of debt, you need to account for that. So he doesn't say ignore it, but you need to have in a bigger picture. And there, I think, where regulations come in, the coronavirus is very much a generational equity sort of thing. We're keeping the kids out of school for what reason? The proponents of that will say, well, we're saving some older people. Okay, there you go. This is a generational trade-off that the kids are kind of fighting the war on behalf of the older people. And that's a trade-off. And we can see where the president comes down on those sort of issues. He's very much tilted, and maybe it's going to cost him votes among the older population, but he's very much tilted toward, we should try to deal with this pandemic in a way that minimizes the harm to the younger people, which is not for them, the harm isn't a health harm. It's learning, it's opportunities to have jobs and that sort of thing.
I agree with that completely. So another question we have is, how did the economic analysis support the tariffs? When you in your chapter on tariffs.
Oh, it doesn't support it at all. Now Kevin Hassett was our chairman, and it was his decision. And I can't say I vigorously disagreed with it. His decision is that the CEA would be unambiguously and unapologetically free trade. So we were always against any restriction on movement of goods or people across the border. I think that's a little bit too pure, but he was thinking about, we have to go back to the profession for whatever reason, take a very pure view on that. When you trade within the country, they don't mind in our profession regulating it and restricting it, but trading with foreigners, somehow you're not allowed to restrict that. And so we stuck with that. Now, once I was writing the book, I was free to say things that I didn't say to the president, or Hassett wouldn't let me say. And what I say in the book is, hey, protectionism's always been around. And let's understand the different forms that it's take. And then from that point of view, let's try to assess, is there an unusual amount of protectionism right now than there has been? And I make the comparison with Reagan. The answer is no. It's very clearly no with Reagan. Reagan was very protectionist. He didn't do it with tariffs. He did it with quotas, which the difference between a tariff and a quota is that the foreign companies get the money instead of our treasury. And I'm not in favor, if we're going to have protectionism, I'm not in favor in doing it in a way that enriches the foreign companies. And people in the Reagan CEA, so older generation, they've contacted me and they said, yeah, Casey, I'll tell you stories where the Japanese came in. Back then it was Japan rather than China. But the Japanese came into the White House and said, please give us a quota. And Reagan gave it to them. Now, Reagan would go out and give beautiful speeches. I recommend go on YouTube and see what Reagan talked about, the virtues of free trade. Nobody says it more beautifully than Reagan, but it's not what he did. And that's the kind of context that I give it. Doesn't mean I support any of that stuff, but I think it needs to go in a context that our profession was not giving that context. They were acting like this is an incredibly unusual situation. And the only thing unusual was the rhetoric, not the fundamental economics.
Yeah. So you kind of answered our last question, which was, given the current situation of this pandemic, what policies or ideas would you hope to see the president pursue for economic recovery? I'm assuming that one of those will be, you'll at least be focused on some intergenerational equity issues, but I'm not going to speak for you. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, my views would not be radical if I wasn't sitting in the United States right now. Yeah. The rest of the world has, for example, got the kids in school. That it is not worth the cost of having kids out of the schoolhouse is so obvious and so certain. There's not a question whether there's a cost. We know there's a cost. But somehow we're paying that cost for sure, so we can avoid the chance that we're not sure because of the theories whether that's going to get anybody sick. I see no sense in that. Other countries see no sense of it. But when you say that here, you're considered radical. I mean, in general, I think the behavior should be kind of in line with what we've done historically. This is worse than a flu, yes. It's not an order of magnitude worse than the flu. So the protections we take should be something like protections we take for flu, maybe more stringent because it's a more dangerous thing, but it should be in that ballpark. And what we're doing is nowhere close. I mean, we didn't never shut down schools for flus. I mean, the whole idea of quarantining the healthy is highly unusual to do for any disease. And that is celebrated right now seems to me to be bad policy. And I think the president agrees with that. I haven't discussed it with him, but you can see what he has to say. Maybe he doesn't believe it, but he knows that there are a lot of silent majority out there who thinks like I'm thinking, and he likes to say what they're thinking because they're afraid to say it.
So this will be our last question. Absolutely. So it is interesting. Have you received any responses from some of the individuals that were heavily indicted in your book? So Alex Azar, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, Jason Furman. Have those individuals reached out to you at all, or?
No, and they won't. I mean, their optimal response. I mean, Krugman, I have a history with. His optimal response is to ignore me, and that's going to be the optimal response here. Hope that not many people read it, but not to start anything. So
do you? And I'm going to end with my own question. Do you think the CEA the last 2 years, if I read the book correctly, it was dramatically more productive than almost any CEA we have in memory? Would that be a fair statement?
I think so. Best CEA ever. That's a little bit hard to go there. I would put us in there. It's like ESPN has those contests. What was the best football team ever? I don't know, but certainly I would want to be in consideration. And that's one reason I thought this book was an opportunity to gather together some kind of objective metrics of our productivity. The president was very supportive. One of the myths is that people can't do their day jobs because they're all busy cleaning up for the president himself. It's the opposite. He really made a productive environment for us, and I really enjoyed. Of course, wouldn't any of us enjoy being in an environment where we can do our thing in a really productive way? And that's what we were doing.
Excellent. Well, Casey, I really thank you for sharing an hour with us, and I thank you for writing the book. If you haven't read the book, you need to get it and read it. It is full of interesting analysis on a slew of different policies, and it's entertaining and well written. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. I also want to thank everyone that joined us, and we're really glad that you came out. We'll be hosting another webinar next week, which will look at political issues around the election and public finance. And so we hope to see everyone next week at our webinar on October 12th. Casey, thank you again. And I really appreciate your book and the time you spent with us and all your comments.
I can't wait to see you guys in person. It's going to be soon.
I can't wait either. It's beautiful weather here. Wish you were here now.
Amen, brother.
We're signing off. Thank you. And thank you to everyone. And have a great day. Bye-bye.